everyone, welcome to the channel. Here's the question for today. Why should I put a camshaft in my Turbo LS? I mean, can't I just turn up the boost with a stock cam? You know how we do it here on this channel. I'm not going to leave you with just one test of a simple camshaft on an LS. I'm going to throw in a little bonus test. How does the exhaust system feeding the turbo affect the power? In this video, we're going to take a look at two different LS tests. The first one is why we put a camshaft in our Turbo LS in the first place and how much power we gain from said cam upgrade. The second test is the exhaust system. How much does the exhaust system feeding the turbo actually affect things like back pressure and ultimately power output? And third, and I never mentioned this before, what mistake did I possibly make on this exhaust test? The question on the table is, why would you put a camshaft in a turbo application? I mean, our already has a stock camshaft in it that we know works well with a turbo. Can't you just turn the boost up? Yes, you can, but I'm going to show you what happens when you run the same boost with a camshaft and how much more power you get after the cam upgrade, because it's really good stuff. So we'll take a look at basically a stock LM7. This was a 5.3 liter from the wrecking yard. It had stock heads on it. I did upgrade it with ARP head studs and head gaskets because we were going to run boost on this thing, but it had stock 706 heads. It had a Trailblazer SS intake manifold instead of the truck intake manifold. And what we did was run this thing NA with 1 7/8" headers. We had our HOLLEY HP management system in it. We had large enough injectors so that we could run boost at a later date. I think that these were 83-pound injectors from HOLLEY. And we ran this thing first NA, and then I'm going to show you what happened when we added a turbo system. We'll get into all that, but run in naturally aspirated trim, our LM7 with the Trailblazer SS intake manifold and long tube headers produced 359 horsepower and 384 foot-pounds. Again, we run it with a Mazir electric water pump and no accessories and no air inlet, and obviously it had headers and collector extension, so nothing that even resembles a factory exhaust system. So that's why this thing makes more than the rated power output. But here's what happened when we installed a turbo kit on our otherwise stock motor. And you can see, obviously, we picked up a lot of power. So we ran a single precision 76mm turbo on this thing. And our ProCharger air-to-water intercooler. The Precision Turbo was a 7675. It was a big CEA turbo, way more turbo than you need for this kind of power. There are lots of different turbos that you could use. We ran the HOLLEY dedicated cast manifolds and a cross-under pipe, and we had a Turbo Smart wastegate with a 7-pound spring in it, and we just ran this thing on the spring, basically, to show you what happens when you add boost to the combination, and run with a peak of, looking at 11 pounds, boost started at 7, and then we had a rising boost curve because we did not have an electronic controller on this. We had a rising boost curve up to 11 pounds. This combination produced 601 horsepower and 614 foot-pounds of torque. But here's what happened when we added a camshaft to the combination. We replaced the factory LM7 camshaft with a Brian TOOLEY Racing Stage 2 camshaft. So here's what happened when we added our camshaft, and again, I'll give you the specs on the camshaft. This camshaft was a Stage 2 turbo cam. It was a 605 598 lift, a 226 231 degree duration split, and 113 degree lobe separation angle. The turbo system all stayed the same. The turbo and the HOLLEY manifold, the cross under with the manifold, and the ProCharger air-to-water intercooler, all of that stuff remain the same, but adding our camshaft, and you can even run a smaller camshaft than this on this combination, but the Stage 2 camshaft a lot of times is a go-to deal for people. So we ran this at a peak boost of 11.1 pounds, so compared to 11 pounds of the peak on the factory camshaft, so it was right exactly the same. The peak power jumped up to 721 horsepower and 644 foot-pounds of torque. You can see we lost a little bit of low-speed power compared to the factory setup, compared to the factory camshaft, I should say. But look at all the gain that we got out on top. And we picked up 120 horsepower from the camshaft. And this, my friends, is why you add a camshaft, any kind of camshaft, Stage 1, Stage 2, whatever it is, to a turbo combination. Because even at the same boost level, within 1/10 of a pound, we're making so much more power. So you're running the same 11 pounds in this combination, and you go from 600 horsepower to 721 horsepower, which obviously is nothing but good. Let's take a look at even more very cool data. Okay, we've demonstrated why it's important to and the benefits of installing a camshaft and replacing the factory cam with almost anything that's better. In our case, we did a very good and very effective, obviously, Brian TOOLEY Racing Stage 2 turbo cam. It doesn't really have to be a turbo cam, but that setup obviously worked very well here. You could do a smaller NA cam, and we've shown these in many, many videos. Put a camshaft in it, a cam and springs, and then obviously the motor will be very happy, to the tune of 120 horsepower at the same boost level in this case. But I want to show you also what happened was we were running the HOLLEY cast iron exhaust manifolds and the merge over on one side and a single wastegate and the cross under pipe and stuff. And I want to show you what happened when we replaced that with basically the DNA tubular headers that we run like on the Big Bang motor, and then a 3-inch Y pipe on the front, a crossover, and 2 wastegates, and then the same turbo and intercooler and all of that stuff. So here's what happened when we replaced the HOLLEY system with our new turbo setup with the headers and different crossover pipe. Here's what happened to our power curve. And as you can see, out at the top from about 5,900 RPM, the power number was very similar, but there's obviously more to the story than that. Below that, we saw a lot more boost response, and we'll go over that when we go over the boost curves. We saw a lot more response. The motor sounded a lot better, obviously, with the headers on it than it does with the cast iron exhaust manifolds. And we saw a big change. Now, part of this is because we actually changed the boost curve on this. Now, putting the new headers on, we didn't do anything to the wastegate controller. We didn't do anything to the wastegate. All of that remained the same. But what happened was we saw a big change in back pressure. And we're going to go over the boost pressure and back pressure curves in a minute. And so the back pressure affects what's happening with the wastegate. It will want to open the wastegate sooner with more back pressure. So we're seeing a change in boost here. And I wish that I would have had an electronic boost controller on this, so we could have stabilized all this stuff. And subsequently, Engine Masters has repeated this test, and they've done that test with an electronic controller, and they're actually going to see much less of a difference. But the story that I'm getting to is the red line here is with the HOLLEY setup, and then the green line here is with the tube headers and stuff. And we see that they made similar power at the top, but the difference is that with the HOLLEY setup, it was at 11 pounds. And then with the header setup, it was only at 9.6 pounds. Like, if we take a consistent number here at, say, 6,200 RPM, there was a big difference in boost pressure. Even at a lower boost pressure, the header setup made more power. So what I did was we turned the boost up and ran a higher boost level so that at 6,200 RPM, everything was the same. The airfield was the same, the timing was the same, and the boost pressure was the same. The only difference that we were showing, according to data logging on the dyno, was a change in back pressure. And we'll go over the back pressure change in just a minute. But we saw a pretty big change in power. So they were both run at 11 pounds there. And we saw a change in power from 712 horsepower up to 763 horsepower. So now let's take a look at the boost and back pressure curves associated with this, because as you can see, without an electronic boost controller to make sure that the boost curves were exactly the same for both combinations, it's more and more difficult to actually tell the difference between the two exhaust systems. So now we're going to take a look at the boost pressure curves, at least the ones provided by the stock camshaft, and then when we changed to the Brian TOOLEY Racing Stage 2 cam, both of them were equipped with the HOLLEY turbo setup. So I wanted to show you that the change in power from 600 horsepower to 721 or 22 horsepower came with no change in boost, actually. So here is the boost curve offered by the turbo setup, the single precision turbo, with the stock camshaft. You see we had a rising boost curve from 7 up to right at 11 pounds. And here's what happened when we added the Brian TOOLEY Racing Stage 2 camshaft. We revved it a little bit higher, as we saw in the power curve. But again, we started off really close, 7.1 or 7.2 pounds, and ended up at 11.1 pounds. But the shape of the curve is exactly the same. So the change that we saw in power basically came from the change in the camshaft and not really from a change in boost. So this shows boost to boost, adding the camshaft to your, replacing the factory LM7 camshaft with almost anything, especially a good one like the Brian TOOLEY Racing Stage 2 turbo cam, resulting in a pretty big power gain. Now that we've demonstrated that the boost was the same going from the stock camshaft to the Brian TOOLEY Racing Stage 2 camshaft, we can take a look at what happened to the boost curve when we changed our exhaust system from the HOLLEY, dedicated cast iron turbo system to our tubular DNA headers and then 3-inch Y pipe. So here, this is our boost curve supplied with the turbo, with the HOLLEY setup, and the Brian TOOLEY Racing Stage 2 turbo cam. You can see we were 7.2 pounds up to just over 11 pounds. But here's what happened when we installed the headers and the 3-inch crossover. You can see that we have a completely different boost curve, and so this is why we should have had an electronic boost controller on this. But this was the power curve, if you remember back, where basically out at the top, the two made the same power. But they made the same power between the headers and the HOLLEY setup. They made the same power, but at different boost levels. The HOLLEY setup was all the way up at 11 pounds, and then our headered setup was down by 9.6 or 9.7 pounds. So even though the peak power curves looked the same, we saw a big difference in boost curve. And so what I did then was, here's what happened when we raised the boost curve to try to equal them. And here, like I was telling you, at 6,200, boost curves are exactly the boost numbers are exactly the same. 11 pounds at 6,200. Airfill is the same. Timing is the same. Boost is the same. Yet we saw a pretty big difference in power. And as we saw elsewhere in the curve, we see a difference in the whole boost curve, which demonstrates, the change in power is basically a difference of the change in boost. But where they were the same, we still saw a difference in power. Now let's check out maybe part of the reason, that is back pressure. Okay guys, according to the data run at the same boost pressure that we monitored at 6,200, same airfield, same timing, the new header system made more power than the stock cast manifolds, and that's not terribly surprising, and we think that we know why here. If we take a look, this is the back pressure run with the HOLLEY setup. At 11 pounds of boost, we had 21.2 pounds of back pressure, which is 2 to 1. It's not terrible, but it's certainly more than after we put the headers on. So here's what happened to the back pressure curve after we installed the headers and the 3-inch Y pipe. And you can see we had the back pressures way down. It's only 13 pounds compared to 21, but this was only at about 10 pounds or so of boost. Here's what happened when we turned the boost up, as I showed you, to equal the boost pressure of the hooker setup or HOLLEY setup. Even then, we still only had about 14.6 pounds of back pressure at the exact same. So if we check here at 6,200, which was our reference number, we have 14.3 pounds of back pressure versus 20.5 pounds of back pressure, where the boost pressure was exactly 11 pounds on both of them, and we saw a difference of 45 or 50 horsepower. So here's my question to you guys, and I want you to comment, would that much back pressure equate to that kind of power difference? Make sure to stick around for the conclusion, which we're getting to now, and I'll tell you why all of this might not be true. Okay guys, this is a perfect example of why when you're doing turbo testing, you want to always run an electronic boost controller. The only way to figure out if you're trying to test something else that's going on besides a change in boost, you need to have the boost pressure be exactly the same. And obviously trying to pick it out at one particular spot is not ideal. That's what makes me think that maybe these results are not 100% accurate. That combined with the fact that the guys from Engine Masters, Brule and Dulcich and Freiberger and those guys just did a very similar test where they, using an electronic controller like you're supposed to, they got different results. Now they got similar results to what I got in terms of the change in, back pressure versus boost pressure. There's definitely a change in back pressure from the two systems. We definitely saw that, but they didn't have the same kind of change in power, and I'll let their videos, you guys need to watch that. I can't wait to watch it too, because I wasn't down there during the testing, but I can't wait to find out exactly what happened. But I know that their power gains were different than mine. So the only thing that this leads me to think is that maybe the data that I'm getting from the dyno, not the horsepower numbers, but maybe the boost number is not exactly the same between the two. That's the nice thing about having an electronic controller, is the controller has a map sensor in it. It says, hey, I want this amount of boost pressure, and nothing else changes. It's going to be the same every time. We've seen lots and lots of repeatability. That's a much better method than me actually trying to equalize it with a manual controller and find the same boost at some given spot. I don't think that's as accurate. There's no doubt that the back pressure is higher on the cast system because of where the merge is. it doesn't flow as well as obviously the headers and our big Y pipe did. We know that that's the case. And I know that if we were to turn the boost way up and run lots more power, if you're trying to do, 4-digit or beyond power level, that cast system would not be ideal. And I'm sure that the Holley and Hooker guys, who are great guys, they know that too, and probably would not recommend that for a guy trying to make 1,500 or 2,000 horsepower. You're going to want to have kind of dedicated exhaust manifolds built, or headers, or those kinds of things to make big power. The nice thing about the Hooker and Holley setup is I like the way that it packages. It fits in a lot of different stuff. It's a good starting point for a lot of guys doing swaps and stuff, and it seems to fit a lot of chassis, which, you can make your own setup fit a chassis, but you're going to have to build it yourself. I'm Richard Roller. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. I got more testing coming up.